reminder before Valentin starts, if you didn't get up there at lunchtime, make sure returning people get registered today so that Marilyn can countersign the form that you're going to turn in tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Josh and Anya, if you're still here, thanks for the help at the break. If you have any more questions that come up over the course of the day, they'll be at the 6 o'clock session up here too with all the tutors, yeah?
Can she sign it before we choose the course?
Indeed she can. Basically, just make sure the registration is done. Okay, everybody, thanks. I'll turn it over to Valentin, Intermediate Unit 10.
Hi, I'm Valentin. I teach Intermediate Unit 10. This is the third year running now. Can you hear me? Is it too loud? It's good. The subject of the year is Addendum. This is sort of the third installment of a series of design ideas or references or themes that the unit has been working with. We started out with a +1, which is sort of a simple extension. We went then over to the aggregate, which is sort of the conglomerate of things, and now obviously the addendum, which refers back to both of them, but is probably slightly more sophisticated and more subtle. Addendum means that which is to be added or taken away or reorganized or rearranged or looked at differently. The unit likes to think of it as a unit that designs through addition or through reorganization. This idea sort of comes from that we like to work with the context. By that we mean you have something and you can look at it and you can understand it and you can comment and add to it. What we don't do is to have the self-standing object on a tabula rasa. So we're not dealing with the self-referential and the self-referential narrative or the only self-referring thing. We always want to look at context and try to organize them in a meaningful way. In a sense, we like to look what's in the cupboard and make a good meal out of that, rather than having everything available from Waitrose, if you know what I mean. Quickly to come to the schedule of the year before I start to talk about the architectural addendum. In a way, I think all of you know, or I believe you know, the things that I try to refer to. But before that, I think I quickly let you know the schedule of the year. And I loosely organized this around the terms tension, charge, discharge, relaxation. It really has not much to do with Wilhelm Reich, but it kind of works so nicely with this kind of annual rhythm of the year, where every year seems to be some kind of resurrection or rebirth. And in a way, we're at the moment in the prelude, the moment of tension, where kind of we don't know where we go and what we do. And term one, in a sense, is the charge, which means we will look at the subject, we'll start to kind of acquire a certain kind of knowledge. By this I mean types of techniques, but also ways of defining things. We do this through a series of exercises that deal with model making, photo montages, but also this year we want to add video, in particular After Effects. As the term After Effects says, it's kind of an addendum, it's an after effect. And the term will finish with a trip to Tokyo over the Christmas break. Term two will then be the discharge, where we will apply the things that we found or that we kind of learned to a site in London that you choose or that we choose together, and then start to develop an architectural proposition. First, maybe slightly more conceptual, and then more literal. This is sort of a part of the unit that the work that we've done in term one and also the trip will form the basis for the proposition in term two. A quick word to Tokyo or Japan. I think these are two island states, Japan and the UK. They have a lot in common in terms of the vision of an empire, but they also have a lot not in common. I mean, I think Tokyo is probably the most densest city in the world by now, 30 million people. The way they arrange and live is quite extraordinary and very interesting, and I think we can probably learn from that, or maybe transplant or absorb something from this. In term 3, we have 2 scenarios. One, that we return to a kind of design competition that we have in term 1, which is really going to be just the first 10 days, right from Friday starting off, or that we apply a rereading of our proposition in term 2. I call this the relaxation because often in order to really kind of understand or to kind of propose something, you need to step back and rethink and post-rationalize. Okay, so let's start. So this was the image of the prospectus, and I've wanted to say a couple of words to this. It's a photo montage, and it's an arch that's been taken from Somerset House. It was embedded into a facade and placed on an empty site that's been empty for 50 years, just up the road in Tottenham Court Road. So it's really quite a prominent place that was shut off, not accessible to the public. So the student put this there in order to justify an access and to claim an open space. And what's interesting about it is that it looks as if it was sort of a ruin, the last bit standing of a great big palace that has been taken down. But in fact, it's the opposite. It's actually the beginning. So I'm going to run through a series of architectural addendums, and hopefully you will recognize some of them, and it becomes clearer what I mean about the reference and the host that the addendum always grafts itself onto. So we start with the ordinary. The ordinary is a house. It's Frank Gehry's house, and it's probably his one of his most interesting projects, because the story goes like this, that his wife bought a pink shed in Santa Monica in a very fancy neighborhood, and he had to add to it. I mean, as architects do, we change our environment, and he expanded it. And he did this with ordinary materials, so there's nothing fancy about it. He could buy the things at a local DIY shop. And in a sense, this is a true addendum in an ordinary way. So you use the ordinary and you make the extraordinary. On the right, on the top corner, you see the neighboring plot, how the house used to look. And then on the left bit further down, you see all the things he's done to it. The other ordinary one is the factor cheval, which is also known as postman cheval. It was in much earlier, 1836. So he's a postman who thought his route was rather repetitive. And one day he stumbled over a stone and he looked what made him trip, and he thought, that's an interesting object. And while he was doing his routes, he had this fantasy of this palace. And through the years, he started to build this palace, bringing objects back from his route as being a postman. Now it's a national heritage, but it's an extraordinary piece of ordinariness, or extraordinariness through ordinarity. The last one is sort of an extension to a ruin or almost ruined house of a friend of mine that I built in Switzerland, which is a little shower. So the building didn't have any shower of the sort. So the first thing you need in order to spend some time is to be able to wash. So this is built out of the most cheap and waterproof sheet material that you can fit into a Fiat Punto. It has 2 lights, 2 hooks. Shoes stay outside, a little radiator on the bottom, and a sink where the water can go away. That's an addendum to a little ruin made with ordinary things. The opposite of the spectrum has the heroic. this is the German Reichstag. Now this has been in this state for quite some time. So when Berlin was divided, the East German parliament built another palace called the Palast der Republik, which is gone. And West Germany had Bonn as their capital, so they didn't use this. But with the reunification, obviously possibilities and questions started to be asked, and it was rebuilt. But before that happened, somebody wrapped it. Christo and Jean-Claude covered the Reichstag. And what's interesting here is that you see the silhouette of the piece. It's almost reinstating it in a different way, although the kind of carcass of the old one is underneath. So, right. And then Norman Foster, there's this drawing of it, which is also quite spectacular because Christo worked on this for a very long time. Imagine German bureaucracy trying to cover their, So he did a lot of these drawings, which are very close to the real thing. And then Foster came along. And he did also, I would say, a very interesting addendum. He reinstated it, make it much more permeable. And in particular, he created this dome, which is now one of the biggest tourist attractions and accessible, so that to a certain degree what is discussed in Parliament is not hidden, or sort of, you have the tourist walking on top of you with the German history. I think that's a good statement to make. The monumental. This is a collage by Superstudio, quite unusual one. Normally Superstudio is used or referred to as something that's mainly collage about scale and the rural and the city. And here the extruded, I think it's called the never-ending monument, or the continuous monument, and which is a series of drawings and collages that depict that mysterious monument all over the world, and here in an urban context, and here another part in a rural context. Now, when the urban comes to find the rural, a very interesting tension starts to occur, to the point where the urban doesn't even have to define itself. Now, this object doesn't have a purpose, doesn't have a function, except for heightening the relationship of its scale and its potential in relationship to the little town, St. Moritz in Switzerland, which is quite a posh and cute little town. The addendum as a doppelganger. Now, doppelganger means something like a twin, or something like that, I guess, not entirely. It's an English word, no? You have a grid of a Rolls-Royce car with a grille embedded on Wall Street, and you have the same one in a quiet little town in Austria. Now, this one sort of works. You can see the silhouette, the pitched roof, an ordinary car. Not quite ordinary in a sense, it's a Rolls-Royce, but here you don't know where it really aligns itself, if it's the silhouette of the mountains, if it wants to be more the mountain, or if it wants to be the little castle on the bottom. The Civic. Now, this is a plan of a proposal of the Lomax, which is the Lower Manhattan Expressway, by Robert Moses. Robert Moses was a developer who is responsible for a large amount of highways on the East Coast. What's particularly interesting about this proposal as an addendum to the perfect city, the grid, New York, and the grid is something so entirely perfect or unfaultable, that what he does is sort of almost mad, sort of undermining. And what this proposal has, it was never built actually, the bottom one, but you had architects speculating on the use of such a highway. This is by Paul Rudolph. And what you see here is Paul Rudolph proposes a Y-shaped corridor which was designed to leave the city infrastructure intact and suggest a new approach to the city building, which claims that transportation networks could bind rather than divide communities. At key points in the transportation corridor, central hub, bridge, or tunnel entrance, there were multi-level stacking pedestrian plazas and people movers, and below existing parking, all above and below existing bridge and rail systems. Tall, stepped-back residential buildings would provide light, air, and views, flanking the corridor at the gateways, and in conjunction with the building type, they would generate urban space. Now, obviously, something had to be removed, and I think that's an interesting question to ask, but overall, here's an extreme addendum to an addendum that somehow tries to create the opposite of how we conceive highways as something that sort of separates and has nothing to do with living or inner city living. The same we have in London. This is an image of the Westway. When it was built, it was really quite controversial. But it's a kind of 3.5 mile or 5.6 kilometer long elevated dual carriageway moving from Paddington to Kensington. And what's interesting about this one is that it creates this sort of departure from central London. So if you imagine yourself moving from Paddington and then continuing and gaining speed, and suddenly you sort of lift off. You're on a highway, and it separates pedestrian from cars. So here you have only the machinic vehicle that allows you to kind of transport you away from that town. It also created a series of references. You have J.G. Ballard talking about the concrete island, where a man has an accident with his car and he falls into that circle in the middle, and he can never leave, and therefore have to kind of deal and create his own environment. At the same time, you have that new highway creating a relationship, a new parapet to the existing. Illustro. Well, here you have something quite ordinary, and something that's just painted onto the existing. It works, but it's also at the same time quite dangerous. An addendum to a surface, which becomes even more sophisticated to a certain degree when you think of the congestion charge. It is marked, but it's virtually invisible, and it actually creates a revenue. So, in a sense, the virtual addendum as the zoning of the congestion charge, or the division of London into boroughs, is somehow a much more softer and subtler way of looking at a reading of a space. Now, you will realize that if you park your car on one side of a borough, you will pay £1 more than on the other side. On the same way, the bins look slightly different, or the color marcation. So the territory that comes with those kind of furnitures are quite interesting. The parasitic. Now, Lebbeus Woods, there are many readings of that type of addendum. In a way, they're kind of sort of phoenixes that come from the ashes. They're more sort of realized versions of that from Korb Himmelblau. And I think what's interesting now that I would like to start to move into sort of from the conceptual slightly more into the real, and sort of the kind of versions that have been dreamed up and how one actually can try to realize them. This is a publication that the unit did a couple of years ago that dealt with the +1 and the grafting on of hosts, of parasites onto hosts. And the dilemma that those kind of extrusions bring with them, that at the end of the day, this is Rory's cover, where he was sort of so disillusioned with the reality that building at the end of the day has to do with gaining more money. And so he quoted Gordon Gekko in greed is good, but obviously it was more ironic. Now the literary, from Bernard Tschumi, his advertising for architecture, I think very powerful, where you take an ordinary image and you add some text, and through that create a much more powerful meaning. The one, of course, with the murder has been not tested, although every year somebody comes and asks me and said, is that real? Which brings me to the polemic. Claes Oldenburg is also a very rare image, is more known for his sort of large-scale objects. But here he inserts a sort of a cute and very tasty lunch snack onto Times Square, which is, sort of the center at times, the shopping center of Manhattan. And it refers to sort of this oversized, large-scale Godzilla or King Kong type, but in a much more cute way. And obviously, the joke is here that you can slip on a banana, whereas actually it is quite friendly. In the same way, you have this kind of scale shift of the handheld object here, a video remote control that turns into a spaceship or aircraft carrier or something like that. And in the same way, if you go back, there seems to be some kind of testing of the object that you hold in your hand, and then it starts to become something else through a slight kind of addition or erasure or kind of shifting of boundaries. The same is with this sort of street of a temple view perspective in Tokyo that turns into a battleship, which is work by Akira Yamaguchi. This brings us into a whole set of objects that in themselves have a beauty and a directionality and a charge that sort of allow us to improve our body and our performance. But in himself, referring back to the banana and the video thing, have a presence that can be seen out of different scales. Obviously, Apple is the ultimate company that produces Addenda. It sort of convinces us that we are not perfect and that we need these things for our lifestyle, and they add to us. And the imagery is sort of as if they were part of our body, external veins connect us to them. The prosthetic, in a way, quite similar to that. And the post-industrial. Now here you have, a lot of you are probably quite familiar with the High Line. Here I have the epitome of an architectural image and something that sort of is so politically correct. You have, you have the woman with the dried flowers, you have the handicapped, you have the businessman, you have the fertile, and it kind of portrays that the elevated lift is made out of nothing, and you have a bit of greenery on top, and it works really quite fantastically and magically, and architecture considers everything. Now, it happens to be not such a bad project, and I actually do like it quite a lot, and it comes up with a lot of interesting solutions about how you merge the existing and the new. But to be true, I just came across these images this morning. This is how it looked before, and it's so much more striking and real. I mean, and it does everything that the other one tries to do, and by just renaming it and claiming it, it would have been probably the better project. In the same way, this is a project by a student of mine a couple of years ago, which is called Promenade. This is Bedford Square. This is where we are. And yeah, I think you can see yourself. And what he proposed is, in the same way like the High Line, in a post-industrial way. Now, London doesn't have the same kind of infrastructure, but rather the Georgian Square could be seen as the mundane and the kind of the higher point which you can claim on top. He proposed that promenade, and he looked very carefully at the existing possibilities of doing that. The viewpoint, previously we've just come in dealing with planning application. I mean, the Bedford Square is probably one of the most protected and cherished places, so you can't just put something on top. This was a new student to the school as well. So he claimed, went on top, didn't tell this to Brett, and he started to really become quite infatuated with it. And he saw himself as this kind of heroic person who would sort of claim the existing in between the chimney pots. And he would do this by looking at the ordinary and the existing step system, which was made, unfortunately you can't see it that well, out of scaffolding material. And he started to develop these kind of excessive possibilities of viewing and resting and placing platforms which would sit on the individual party walls of each of those initially residential Georgian houses. And you would get this kind of relationship of the flaneur and the city, and an additional sort of, much more sort of precise proposition of conditions that would occur on that promenade. A superimposed. This is a project by Leon Krier, which sort of derived out of a reading of the Nolly plan. And what he does is he inserts the sort of primitive hut, 8 stories high, into the St. Peter's Square. What he creates is an open market and a public space. And I suppose the sort of importance of this is that historical projects can be extremely radical. Now, this is the view out of St. Peter's. This is the view the Pope has. And what he does is he blocks that view with that public market, which normally would be the axis coming down, looking at, I'm not sure, I forgot what it's called, but it has this kind of amazing axis coming down to St. Peter's. The unprovoked addendum, or the catastrophic, is the earthquake, which then, as a result, has a tsunami. Quite shocking, and I kept those images for a long time when it happened in order to, never knew what to do with it, but whenever I visited them, there was something quite striking and beautiful about them, which disturbed me a lot, because obviously it's such a horrific catastrophe, and at the same time it bears that level of beauty, in a very humane way, because obviously these are objects and things we produce that reflect our culture and our sense of organization. And so I asked myself, what makes it so powerful is that it's real. No, it's not Photoshop, it's not collage, it's not fantasy. This is reality, and that natural and that materiality is something so important and striking to us, I guess, and also to the unit. And this project by Carlos Scarpa is it's called, what is it called again? The Monument to the Partisan Woman, which is in Venice. It's a very beautiful and subtle project which sort of displays a series of man-made artificial rocks that appear quite natural and sort of inconspicuous. In the same way, his Olivetti's storeroom or showroom, this is, I think, architecture in its finest to a certain degree. A lot can be said about the proportions, the not obedience of a certain kind of grid, but at the same time depicting lines, even typography, openings. And the view on San Marco Square. The dangerous. We're turning from fantasy into reality. This is Marcel Duchamp after he left Europe in 1942, I think it was. And he inserted that web-like string into a New York gallery, a very confrontational project. And to a certain degree, a lot, very, referenced a lot, only 1 or 2 images exist of that. And here sort of the addendum is quite provocative, but very real. Not only does he disguise the art of other people, he makes it virtually inaccessible. When I was a diploma student, we did projects that verged on the dangerous. And again, here, this was pre-Photoshop and pre-digital cameras. So in order to create a real image, you had to actually make it and stage it. So we did a dinner party on a traffic island and invited people from the cast to come in. So in a sense, I don't object to any form of staging or whatever you want to call this, testing of the actual city in order to create or understand the context or the image in a certain way. The New Frontier. The New Frontier is, again, a part that the unit did 2 years ago, where we sort of opened up the corridor from the soft room, I think from the back members room, studio up there, to the terrace. And this was a very real project with a lot of effort. So again, you see a lot of images that sort of try to mimic this kind of opening or hole, but they are Photoshop. But once you try to make them in reality, they come with a certain kind of quality and a control. And again, Marcel Deschamps on the right did that, pre-Photoshop a long time ago, where he sort of staged the model. This image you see on the side is not a painting, it's a photograph of a model that he worked on for 10 years while he was pretending to be a chess player. And sort of this breaking through of the terrace looking down onto Morwell Street is sort of an attempt of the unit to break away from the virtual and the sort of photoshopped to sort of the real, and through very simple effects or very simple sort of moves to create something quite striking. And therefore we had to mount, or we took an ordinary object like the mirror that you encounter everywhere in every building, and we added that to the roof in order to create this sort of hyper-real effect. In the same way, the door is nothing spectacular, but at the same time it's extremely controlled and fairly simple and possibly subtle. And so I suppose the message is that you can create something very spectacular without standing out and possibly people even not noticing it. The public, or possibly domestic, is a series of installations or pieces that we've done with my media class. Another one installed on the terrace upstairs, slightly disturbing at the same time, but also very playful, sort of creating reactions and a different use of a public space. I just put this in because it was part of the package in the slides, and it's an experimentation of adding a piece that uses the flexibility of the back of a chair. The chairs you're sitting on, by the way, and it was quite extraordinary how much it could give, and they had a lot of fun with doing that. It produced some very interesting drawings that sort of would analyze the build, and then also its performance. The composed. This is Bernard Tschumy's idea for Parc de la Villette. I'm only using this in order to get to the next slide. So I think this is a diagram which deals with an explosion of the existing in order then to distribute itself, for the ones who are familiar with this, where it distributes itself and then creates these follies or smaller pavilions which then have been built. You could argue if this is a good or a bad architectural project. The locals seem to like it. Still, I think it's arguable. But what's very interesting about this is that the sort of the rigor and the principle of the design is very clear. So it's two forces. It's the solid and the explosion, which is recomposed in order to make something new. And in a sense, this is something that we like to look at on a 2D plane. you look at the work of Gabriela Roscoe, and so this is called 5 butterflies, and through a series of rotations, he kind of transforms the sort of figurative, something that we are familiar with but actually not, something that's symmetrical, so seemingly we know about it, but at the same time not, into something quite new and special. So the means of transformation are very subtle, and the effect is great. I suppose that is what the unit is after. He did another version of this 2 years later, less change, and I think more selection in the species and a greater effect. And this can also happen when you look at the found and you start to rearrange or align it in a certain way. So you don't have to add a lot in order to get a meaningful and great effect. Thank you very much.